Hey Steve, what are you tying up today?
Mostly I'm in Spring Creek patterns, but with a focus on CDC. I mean, obviously, I think that's some of the better material to tie, flies out of, especially for fisheries that get a lot of pressure. And I've always been a big fan of CDC, so I thought I'd focus on that.
Yeah, I've been tying a little bit with CDC, but where does the actual CDC feather come from?
It comes from all waterfowl, and it comes from a gland on the back, the duck, and lower on the back. And there's a little gland that sits up there. In fact, you'll notice that ducks always have their bills back there and excretes oil, and this unique feather just sits around that gland. It's nowhere else on the body of the duck. So when you get gray or natural CDC, the feather's already saturated with this oil, and that's why it floats so well. The other ones, which they have to dye, unfortunately, it removes the CDC, and then they have to treat it again. So probably, my guess is that the natural, just by itself, has more oil in it, and has better floating properties overall, and probably better staying properties. But if you look at one of these feathers, under high magnification, it's unbelievable. It's super saturated. And there's different kinds of CDC too. I mean, if you look in these bags, especially like these big trout hunter bags, which, are expensive, but you look at how much is in here, and they really are value compared to some of the smaller ones. But the smaller ones, by nature's spirit, the feathers are uniquely different. They're like a lot smaller. They're a lot finer. So, I think they probably one comes from a domestic animal, and maybe one comes from a wild animal. But a wild duck, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, like the trout hunter CDC bags are a European goose is where they get most of them. They're a foie gras bird that's raised to like 6-7 years old, full age. It's an old fat duck, or goose in this case. And they
Is it domestic?
I believe they're domestic. I'm not 100% certain though. I think it's a domestic bird that they're raising. It's like raised like a family pet. So when they harvest them, finally they're old birds that are fat and heavy and have had a full natural life versus a young bird that might not have quite as full a feather count or as heavy a feather.
But, they're definitely different. I mean, if you pull that bag out, you have these big, really dense feathers, and you have other ones that are quite sparse. And the ones by nature's spirit, I mean, they've obviously hand-picked them. And, I prefer those for smaller flies. If you look like a little 20s, 22s, those types of flies, I really like the nature's spirit. So, when you talk about CDC, similar to marabou and a lot of other natural materials, certain, feathers in this instance are good for certain types of flies, whether it's size, whether it's the density of the feather, or whether you want, where you're trying to get the fly to be presented in the water column. So it's not like you just pick, if you're tying a CDC fly, you just grab some CDC feathers.
Right.
You really need to go through them and look at the differences in them and select the ones that are appropriate for the size, the type of fly you want to tie, depending on how you want the fly to present itself once it's on the water.
CDC is a really versatile material. You'll see it on a lot of different stuff, whether it's an emerger type pattern. They work pretty well on nymph patterns. They trap air better than most feathers.
It's unbelievable.
If you look at them under a microscope, they have tiny little barbs like this off of the stem that actually trap air in addition to the preen oil. So I mean, they have multiple levels of flotation, but they're also a little more high maintenance on the water, because they do, once they're saturated, you have to dry them back out to really get their maximum float again.
With things like frog fanny and stuff like that, that really kind of takes that out of the equation now, and makes that process, it's a lot easier to deal with. But the other thing that people don't really talk about with flies, and I think it's really important, especially on certain types of flies, when you're imitating mayflies or you're imitating caddis flies, when a fish eats those flies, they're soft.
Right.
I mean, you pick one up in your hand, and they're hardly perceptible, right? And so, when you start tying drakes, for example, and you use big hair wings and stuff like that, well, when a fish goes to eat those, I mean, they feel that resistance to that hair. It doesn't feel anything like the natural. And the fishes, especially on a pressured fishery, trout are very likely to spit those right away. Where this is much softer, it's much more supple, it's much more like the natural insect. And so I think the flies, when they eat a fly that's made out of this material, those differences aren't as noticeable, and they're more likely to, I call them eating flies. Yeah. In the old days, we used to make our drakes out of calf or deer hair wings, and they float great. Fish eat them really well because they have good silhouettes.
Yeah.
But you'd notice you don't get very many hookups because they'd spit them. So I think that's a really great quality of CDC that not a lot of people talk about. Not only does it look good, I mean, it makes gorgeous flies, but I think from once a fish eats the fly, I think that's important too.
Right. And also, CDC is really versatile from a sizing standpoint. As long as you have a large enough feather, you can tie giant flies, or you can tie down to really tiny stuff. Like the only winging material that I use on really tiny dry flies is almost exclusively CDC, because you can tie them down to 26 if you want, or even smaller.
Well, even for big flies, it's much easier to deal with hair.
Yeah.
I mean, hair is really a challenge.
Yeah, you have to have perfect hair to make a perfect fly, whereas CDC you can have an imperfect feather and still make a perfect fly.
It's you know, kind of interesting that I mean, we do really well in general and here with our customers with CDC flies because, you know, obviously we like them and we fish them a lot, but across, you know, the industry, you look at commercial flies and even flies that people fish, and it's not really still very well adapted. You know, and I think by far, especially for spring creek or tailwater fisheries like the Provo or the green that see a lot of people, it's just an incredible material, and it's really fun to tie with, especially in the dyed colors you have now. I mean, between Trout Hunter and Nature Spirit, I think the colors are just incredible. I mean,
sky's the limit with color.
Oh yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, it's great stuff.
And why can't you use the liquid floatants on CDC?
It mats the feathers. I mean, there are actually preen oils that you can put on. Trout Hunter makes one, for example, that you can put on a CDC feather, but what it does is it actually mats the feathers, and it takes away that property, that great property that they have. And so literally with one false cast, you flick the water off the feather and away it goes. And the problem when you put oils on them, it mats all those barbules together, and so
that's why you want to go more
it doesn't
with that
float
dry
as well.
shake.
Yeah, so you want to use dry shake. I prefer not to use. That's a great question. I mean, I prefer not to use anything at all. You know, if I have like a dry fly that I'm fishing, and one of my favorites that I like to use CDC in is the spent partridge caddis. I'll turn it upside down and I'll take my fingers and I'll pinch and hold the CDC in my finger, and I'll just put a little bit of floating on the belly of the fly. But again, it depends on, you know, sometimes I don't even want it to float that well. So I use they float so well and they have such great properties that I prefer not to use anything except frog fanning when you catch a fish and they get saturated and whatnot, or one of the powdered desiccants. But I think frog fanning I'd much rather use that than Shimazaki. I think Shimazaki kind of messes those feathers up. You need something a little finer. It's good for big flies.
It's kind of sandy, and so like it's great if you're trying to dry out like a stimmy, but it's not as nice on a delicate 22, you know, CDC emerger type fly.
And the feathers, I mean, in your box, I mean, they're as delicate as they look, they're indestructible. I mean, a CDC fly always looks great.
Yeah.
You know, you take regular feathers, the stem gets bent, you know, and it kind of gets messed up, and and they hold their shape in the water really well too. I mean, I think, especially like for one of the patterns I'm going to tie is a spinner pattern, and you know, when this stuff gets in the water, I mean, it has great movement to it, you know, and those air bubbles that get trapped because of the oils and the way the barbules are separated and everything. I mean, it looks like a natural. When they land on the water, they trap a lot of air bubbles, and it does, you know, it does a lot of things to mimic life really, really well, which is cool.
Yeah, and you know, like you said, there's places to apply floating on CDC flies, like the Last Chance Cripple, which is one of our best-selling mayfly patterns, period, whether it's green drakes, blue wing olives, or something in between. Those flies are designed to hang vertically in the water column, and you really want to make sure that you don't get any floating on that butt end of the fly. You want that thing to lay in like it's an emerging insect versus laid out flat in kind of a non-realistic look.
Right.
You know, you really just focus on what needs to float. And you know, usually with CDC flies, the best case scenario is just rotate through if they get to a point of saturation where the powder isn't quite working anymore. You can always just switch it out with another one.
You know, and the other thing, value-wise, it's a great value. I mean, compared to hackles. I mean, it allows you to lose hackles in a much more sparing fashion. And I mean, hackles are getting more and more expensive, especially with what's going on right now. And you know, it's getting harder to find good hackles, or it will be anyway in the upcoming year, for certain types of hackles, but it gives you, I think, as good a fly or even better in a lot of respects, and it makes those, you know, $90 chicken necks go a little bit further.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think that's another good value there. That's, that you find in CDC. So this will be fun today. I'm looking forward to it. Help me fill my box up too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be a little selfish here.
Yeah.
It's like I need to
Yeah.
stack up
Restock.
Restock, yeah.
Nice.